The summer of 1941 arrived in the Western Soviet Union not with the usual rhythms of harvest and heat, but with the roar of German artillery and the thunder of panzer divisions tearing through the frontier defenses. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22nd, had shattered the illusion of peace that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had briefly provided. Within weeks, entire Soviet armies were encircled. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers marched into captivity, and the Wehrmacht advanced with a speed that shocked both Berlin and Moscow. In the chaos of retreat and desperate reorganization, the Soviet state reached deep into its population, mobilizing everyone who could contribute to the war effort. This was total war in its most absolute form, and it would consume the lives of millions before its conclusion. Among the countless young people swept up in this catastrophic summer was a 16-year-old boy from a peasant family, unremarkable in almost every way except for what he would become. His name was Vasily Kurka, and within 4 years he would be credited with killing 179 enemy soldiers and officers, and even downing a reconnaissance aircraft with rifle fire alone, an almost unthinkable feat that speaks to both skill and extraordinary circumstance. Vasily Kurka did not come from a long line of hunters. He had not grown up in the forests of Siberia or the Ural Mountains, where boys learned to track game and handle firearms as naturally as they learned to walk. He was not the son of a veteran marksman or a Cossack warrior with generations of military tradition behind him. He was simply a peasant's son, one among millions of rural Soviet youth whose lives revolved around agricultural labor, school when it was available, and the grinding poverty that characterized much of the countryside even after more than 2 decades of Soviet rule. There was nothing in his background that suggested he possessed any particular talent for the deadly art of sniping. Yet war has a way of revealing abilities that peacetime never demands, and the crucible of the Eastern Front would transform this unremarkable teenager into one of the most effective snipers of the entire Second World War. In the summer of 1941, as the German advance threatened to overwhelm the entire Western Soviet Union, Vasily was mobilized into the labor reserves in the Vinnytsia region of Ukraine. The labor reserve system, established in October 1940 under the State Labor Reserves Decree, was designed to train young workers for Soviet industry. But with the outbreak of war, these reserves became a critical source of manpower for both military and industrial needs. Young men and women were assigned to factories, construction projects, and support roles that freed up more experienced workers and soldiers for combat duties. For many 16-year-olds, this would have been the extent of their contribution to the war effort, at least until they reached the age of formal conscription. But Vasily Kurka was not content to remain in the rear. The German invasion had triggered a wave of patriotic fervor across the Soviet Union, mixed with genuine fear of what Nazi occupation would mean. Reports of atrocities were already filtering back from the occupied territories, and the Soviet propaganda machine, whatever its other failings, was entirely accurate in its depiction of the existential threat that Nazi Germany posed to the Soviet people. Vasily wanted to fight, and he was determined to find a way to the front. Through a combination of persistence, perhaps some falsification of his age, and the desperate need for manpower that characterized the Red Army in those catastrophic early months, Vasily managed to enlist in the 395th Rifle Division. The Soviet Rifle Division was the standard combined arms formation of the Red Army, theoretically comprising around 14,000 men organized into 3 rifle regiments, artillery units, and various support elements. In practice, especially in 1941 and 42, most divisions were severely under strength, hastily assembled from whatever personnel and equipment could be scraped together, and thrown into combat with minimal training. The 395th Rifle Division was formed in the chaos of the war's opening phase, and like most units of that period, it faced the German Wehrmacht with inadequate weapons, insufficient ammunition, and officers who were often learning the realities of modern warfare at the same time as their men. The purges of 1937 and 38 had decimated the officer corps, removing experienced commanders and replacing them with politically reliable but often militarily incompetent appointees. The price for this ideological purification was being paid in blood on the battlefields of Ukraine and Belarusia. Vasily was initially assigned to a rear unit within the division, a frustrating position for a young man eager to prove himself in combat. But opportunity came in an unexpected form when the regiment opened a sniper course under the direction of Sergeant Maxim Brixin, a renowned marksman who had already distinguished himself in combat. The Soviet emphasis on sniper warfare was not accidental. It grew out of both practical necessity and doctrinal evolution. During the Winter War against Finland in 1939 and 40, Soviet forces had suffered terribly at the hands of Finnish snipers, particularly the legendary Simo Häyhä, who was credited with over 500 kills. The Finns had demonstrated how effectively trained marksmen could disrupt enemy operations, eliminate officers and specialists, and impose a psychological burden that far exceeded their numbers. The Red Army absorbed this lesson, and as the Great Patriotic War progressed, sniper training became increasingly systematized and prioritized. Snipers were not merely shooters. They were force multipliers who could shape the battlefield through selective elimination of key targets. Vasily immediately enrolled in the sniper course, recognizing it as both his path to the front lines and an opportunity to develop a skill that would make him valuable to his unit. The training under Sergeant Brixin was intensive and practical, drawing directly from combat experience rather than theoretical manuals. A character reference from this period noted that Vasily diligently studied the rifle and eagerly absorbed the many combat episodes from the life of Sniper Brixin. This mentorship relationship was crucial. Brixin was not teaching marksmanship in the abstract. He was passing on hard-won knowledge about survival and effectiveness in actual combat conditions. The Eastern Front was not a shooting range. It was the environment of constant danger, where a sniper had to balance aggression with caution, where a single mistake could mean death, and where success depended as much on fieldcraft and patience as on the ability to hit a distant target. What became apparent during training was that Vasily possessed a natural aptitude for this work that went beyond simple marksmanship. The courageous teenager demonstrated great potential, and his instructors quickly recognized that they had found someone special. He was distinguished not only by his marksmanship, but also by his attention to detail, an absolutely critical quality for a sniper. He could identify enemy snipers by subtle signs on the ground, the disturbed earth around a firing position, the unnatural arrangement of debris that might conceal a hide, the faint trail left by someone moving into position before dawn. He could identify enemy firing positions by the slightest movement of leaves, a skill that required not just sharp eyes but an understanding of natural patterns, the ability to distinguish between wind-caused motion and that created by human presence. Perhaps most valuably, he could identify German officers by their gestures, their bearing, the way they moved and commanded, even at distances where uniforms and insignia were difficult to distinguish. This ability to read the battlefield, to extract meaning from tiny details that others missed, transformed Vasily from a good shot into a genuinely dangerous sniper. On May 9, 1942, Vasily opened his combat account. The date is significant because, by this point, the war had entered a new phase. The German advance had been stopped before Moscow in December 1941, the first major defeat of the Wehrmacht in the war. The spring of 1942 saw both sides preparing for renewed offensives, with the Germans focusing their efforts on the southern sector, driving toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the symbolic prize of Stalingrad. The 395th Rifle Division was engaged in the grinding defensive battles that characterized this period, fighting to slow the German advance, trading space for time, and inflicting casualties wherever possible. It was in this context that Vasily achieved his first confirmed kill, a moment that marked his transition from trainee to combat sniper. The psychology of that first kill is something that cannot be overlooked. Taking a human life, even in war, even when that person is an enemy soldier actively trying to kill you and your comrades, is a profound act that affects different people in different ways. Some soldiers never adjust to it, suffering psychological trauma that manifests during or after the war. Others compartmentalize it, treating it as a necessary job divorced from moral consideration. The best snipers, paradoxically, seem to be those who can acknowledge the gravity of what they are doing while still maintaining the emotional discipline to do it repeatedly and effectively. Vasily appears to have fallen into this category. There is no record of him expressing doubt or hesitation about his role, but neither is there evidence of the kind of sadistic enjoyment that characterized some snipers. He was a professional, doing a job that his country desperately needed done, and he did it with increasing skill and effectiveness. Over the following months and years, Vasily's tally grew steadily. The total of 179 confirmed kills places him among the most successful Soviet snipers of the war, though not at the very top. For comparison, the highest-scoring Soviet sniper was Mikhail Surkov, with 702 confirmed kills, followed by Ivan Sidorenko with 500, and the famous Lyudmila Pavlichenko with 309. Vasily Zaitsev, perhaps the most internationally famous Soviet sniper due to the film Enemy at the Gates, was credited with 242 kills during the Battle of Stalingrad alone. But these numbers, while impressive, require context. Confirmation standards varied between units and periods of the war. Some snipers operated in target-rich environments where opportunities were plentiful, while others faced more challenging conditions. The quality of targets mattered as much as quantity. A sniper who consistently eliminated officers and specialists was more valuable than one who simply accumulated kills against ordinary soldiers. Vasily's record suggests a balance of both quantity and quality, with his kills including not just infantry, but also officers who would have been more cautious and harder to target. The claim that Vasily shot down a reconnaissance aircraft is particularly remarkable and requires examination. Aircraft were not typical sniper targets for obvious reasons. They moved at high speed, were usually at significant altitude, and were constructed of materials that could withstand more punishment than a human body. However, there are documented cases of aircraft being brought down by small arms fire, particularly in the early war period, when many reconnaissance aircraft were slow, lightly armored, and operated at relatively low altitudes to observe enemy positions. The most likely scenario is that Vasily engaged a low-flying reconnaissance aircraft, possibly an observation plane like the Fieseler Phi 156 Storch or a liaison aircraft, and managed to hit either the pilot or a critical component like the engine or fuel system. Such a shot would have required not just marksmanship, but also an understanding of ballistics, lead calculation, and an enormous amount of luck. That it is listed among his achievements suggests it was witnessed and confirmed by other soldiers, making it part of his official record rather than legend or exaggeration. In early 1943, Vasily was sent to a short-term command course, a recognition of his abilities and a reflection of the Red Army's desperate need for effective junior officers. The Soviet military education system during the war was necessarily abbreviated, with courses lasting weeks or months rather than years, focusing on practical skills rather than theoretical knowledge. These crash courses produced officers who learned through doing, who survived by applying lessons immediately in combat, and who died in staggering numbers as the Red Army ground down the Wehrmacht through a combination of improving skill and overwhelming material superiority. After completing this course, Vasily was promoted to junior lieutenant, a rank equivalent to second lieutenant in Western armies, and given command of a sniper platoon. This was a significant responsibility. A sniper platoon typically consisted of multiple sniper pairs or teams, and the platoon commander was responsible not just for his own performance, but for training, positioning, and employing his snipers effectively across the unit's sector. Vasily also became a sniper instructor, passing on his knowledge to new students just as Sergeant Brixen had passed it on to him, creating a chain of expertise that multiplied the effectiveness of the Red Army's sniper program. The period from 1943 to 1945 saw the Red Army transformed from a force barely holding on to one conducting massive, coordinated offensives that drove the Germans steadily westward. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 broke the back of German offensive capability on the Eastern Front. The liberation of Ukraine, Belarusia, and the Baltic states followed through 1944. By 1945, Soviet forces were fighting on German soil and pushing toward Berlin. Vasily participated in this great advance, his unit part of the massive force that rolled westward, liberating occupied territories and carrying the war into the heart of the Third Reich. The nature of combat changed during this period. The desperate defensive battles of 1941 and 42 gave way to mobile warfare, with Soviet forces conducting breakthrough operations, encirclements, and rapid advances that the Germans could no longer contain. For snipers, this meant adapting to new conditions, operating in urban environments, dealing with German forces that were increasingly desperate and fanatical, and maintaining effectiveness even as the character of the battlefield shifted. On January 13, 1945, Vasily Kurka died in Poland. The circumstances of his death are not detailed in the available records, but the date and location are significant. By January 1945, Soviet forces were conducting the Vistula-Oder offensive, a massive operation that aimed to clear Poland and position the Red Army for the final assault on Berlin. The offensive, launched on January 12th, involved over 2 million Soviet soldiers and achieved stunning success, advancing hundreds of kilometers in a matter of weeks and bringing Soviet forces to within striking distance of the German capital. Vasily died on the second day of this offensive, likely in the intense fighting that characterized the breakthrough phase of such operations. After nearly 4 years of combat, after surviving the desperate battles of 1941 and 42, the grinding attrition of 1943, and the great advances of 1944, he fell just months before the war's end. He was 20 years old. His military awards included the Order of the Red Banner and the Order of the Red Star, as well as the Medal for the Defense of the Caucasus. These decorations tell the story of his service. The Order of the Red Banner was one of the highest Soviet military decorations, awarded for exceptional courage in combat. The Order of the Red Star was given for significant contributions to the defense of the Soviet Union, often awarded to soldiers who had distinguished themselves through skill rather than a single act of heroism. The Medal for the Defense of the Caucasus indicated that Vasily had participated in the bitter fighting in southern Russia during 1942 and early 1943, when German forces drove toward the oil fields of Baku and threatened to cut the Soviet Union off from its primary fuel supplies. These were not participation medals. They were recognition of genuine achievement in combat, earned through blood and skill. The story of Vasily Kurka is in many ways the story of the Soviet Union's war effort in microcosm. He was an ordinary person thrust into extraordinary circumstances, someone with no particular background or training who discovered an aptitude for a highly specialized and deadly skill. He was part of a system that, for all its brutality and inefficiency, was capable of identifying talent and developing it rapidly in response to desperate need. He fought in a war that was genuinely existential for his country, where defeat would have meant not just political subjugation, but systematic extermination. The Nazi plan for the occupied Soviet territories, outlined in documents like the General Plan Ost, called for the murder of tens of millions of Slavs and the reduction of the survivors to slave labor. Soviet soldiers like Vasily were fighting not just for Stalin or communism, but for the survival of their families, their communities, and their very existence as a people. The effectiveness of Soviet snipers during the Second World War had lasting impacts on military doctrine and training. The Red Army's systematic approach to sniper warfare, developed through bitter experience, became a model studied by other militaries. The psychological impact of snipers, their ability to create fear and uncertainty far beyond their actual numbers, was thoroughly documented and analyzed. The tactical applications, from eliminating key personnel to disrupting enemy operations to providing intelligence through observation, became standard components of military planning. In the decades after the war, Soviet sniper doctrine continued to evolve, influencing training programs in the Warsaw Pact and being exported to Allied nations around the world. The legacy of wartime snipers like Vasily Kurka lived on in the professional military education of multiple generations. But beyond doctrine and tactics, the story of Vasily Kurka raises profound questions about war, youth, and the transformation of ordinary people into instruments of death. He was 16 when he entered military service, an age when most people in peacetime are concerned with school, friends, and the normal anxieties of adolescence. By 17, he was killing enemy soldiers with calculated precision. By 20, he was dead. Having taken 179 lives, and having given his own, in a war that consumed more than 27 million Soviet citizens. There is something both inspiring and deeply tragic about this trajectory. Inspiring because it demonstrates human adaptability, the capacity to rise to challenges and develop skills under pressure, the courage to face death repeatedly in service of a cause. Tragic because it represents the waste of potential, the cutting short of a life that might have achieved great things in peace, the necessity of transforming children into killers because the alternative was enslavement and genocide. The Great Patriotic War, as the Soviet Union called its part in the Second World War, fundamentally shaped the nation and its people. The victory over Nazi Germany became the central myth of Soviet identity, the proof that the Soviet system worked, the justification for sacrifices past and future. Veterans like Vasily, had he survived, would have been celebrated as heroes, their stories told and retold, their sacrifices honored in monuments and ceremonies. For those who did not survive, their memory was supposed to serve as inspiration and warning. Inspiration to future generations to defend the motherland with equal courage. Warning to potential enemies that the Soviet people would fight with unmatched determination when threatened. The reality was more complex, as the Soviet Union struggled with the trauma of the war, even as it celebrated the victory. But the centrality of the war experience to Soviet and later Russian identity cannot be overstated. In examining the life of Vasily Kurka, we see not just an individual story, but a window into the broader experience of the Eastern Front, the largest and bloodiest theater of the bloodiest war in human history. We see the desperation of the early period, when the Soviet Union mobilized every available resource, including teenage boys, to slow the German advance. We see the adaptation and learning as the Red Army developed effective tactics and identified talented individuals who could employ them. We see the grinding attrition of years of combat, the steady accumulation of small victories that added up to strategic success. And we see the terrible cost, measured not in abstract statistics, but in individual lives like that of a peasant's son who became one of the best snipers of the war and died at 20 in a Polish winter, so close to the end that he could almost have touched it. The modern consequences of the Eastern Front extend far beyond military history. The Soviet victory, achieved at such staggering cost, established the USSR as a superpower and set the stage for the Cold War. The territorial gains made during the final offensives of 1945 created the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe that would last until 1989. The trauma of the war, the memory of cities destroyed and populations decimated, created a Soviet and later Russian obsession with security and buffer zones that continues to shape geopolitics today. The cult of the Great Patriotic War in Russian political culture, the annual Victory Day celebrations, the reverence for veterans and war memorials, all stem from the experience that Vasily Kurka and millions like him endured. Understanding this history, understanding the individual stories that comprise it, is essential to understanding the world that emerged from that conflict and the tensions that persist into our present day. The teenager who became one of the best snipers of World War II was not just a skilled soldier. He was a participant in events that shaped the entire second half of the 20th century and continue to reverberate in the 21st.